Today I'm going to be talking about a pair of studies in which we attempted to investigate the neural bases of autobiographical memory retrieval with fMRI and overt speech. And let's begin by addressing the question of what autobiographical memory is. So autobiographical memory is the type of memory that people are typically describing when they colloquially refer to memory. It's memory for every event that you've ever been part of, as well as breakfast what you ate for breakfast yesterday. And within the studies that I'm presenting today, I'm going to define autobiographical memory specifically as episodic memory from one's personal history. It's also worth mentioning that autobiographical memory includes semantic memory content and requires encoding, consolidation, and retrieval processes. However, today I'll only be discussing episodic autobiographical memory retrieval. An important note to emphasize is that autobiographical memory is essential to everyday life. Autobiographical memory comprises the entirety of an individual's life history, and through these set of memories, autobiographical memory also supports an enduring sense of self, as well as guiding behavior based on past experiences and supporting social functions. And since autobiographical memory is so important, it's likewise valuable to investigate how the brain is supporting the cognitive process, these cognitive processes supporting autobiographical memory, so that we can understand how brain areas involved in retrieval function in both health and disease. Additionally, since autobiographical memory retrieval unfolds over an extended period of time as compared to episodic memory for things like lists of words or images, it's well suited to investigating using functional magnetic resonance imaging. All right, so let's go over an example autobiographical memory. So imagine that someone asked me to recall a time prior to lockdowns in which I visited a coffee shop. I would search through my memories, identify this specific example and share with you. I would share that last month I was tired all afternoon, so I walked to Starbucks and bought a coffee and donut. Then I realized I was late for a meeting and I was feeling anxious about being late, so I ate the donut while I jogged back to the office. Once I've shared this memory narrative, we can go back through the transcript of this memory and identify rich memory detail or content via parsing through the memory and identifying object words like coffee and donut, scene words like Starbucks and office, temporal words, action words, and emotional content words, as well as many other categories. And using this method of identifying memory content within narratives, we can interrogate what brain regions are more active during retrieval of specific categories or even specific instances of content. But to examine what brain regions are supporting specific components of autobiographical memory retrieval, first let's review a set of autobiographical retrieval brain regions that we commonly refer to as the core network. These are the regions that are the most commonly active in studies of overall autobiographical memory, though this is not an exhaustive list. There are other regions involved, but they're often less frequently observed. However, though the core network is commonly observed to activate during overall autobiographical memory retrieval, it's important to emphasize that different regions are active during different phases of autobiographical memory retrieval. One way to conceptualize autobiographical memory retrieval is as two distinct, though closely related phases, search and elaboration. And in this conceptualization of autobiographical memory retrieval, when an individual is presented with a memory cue, they first begin to search through their memories until they have a memory in mind that meets the criteria of the cue, whatever those criteria may be, and then they begin to relive or elaborate on that memory. And though there are comparatively few studies of these distinct phases, findings from these studies support that different core network regions are more active during, for example, search and elaboration. For example, the hippocampus has been observed to be more active during the earlier, during the earlier phases of search, and then smoothly transitions to less activity during the elaboration phase as other superior or posterior regions come online. So building from these ideas of examining temporal dynamics during autobiographical memory retrieval and parsing narratives for content, today I'll be presenting two experiments analyzing the same data set and using overtly narrated In-fMRI-Scanner autobiographical memory retrieval. Experiment 1 is going to focus on measuring and comparing what brain regions are active during different conditions. And experiment 2 will examine how those brain regions supporting autobiographical memory retrieval form into functionally connected networks. So these two studies share three broadly similar main goals, the first of which was to compare narrated and silent autobiographical memory retrieval by measuring to what extent neural correlates and patterns of functional connectivity depend on these retrieval modalities, so silent versus narrative retrieval. Further, motivation for this main goal was primarily to bridge the gap between the broad literature of fMRI studies that have been performed to date using silent retrieval in the scanner, and a limited number of newer studies which are beginning to increasingly become interested in using overt retrieval methods. Thus far, no one has compared silent autobiographical memory retrieval to narrated autobiographical memory retrieval. And as a result, it's unknown to what extent activations differ between silent and narrative retrieval. And if there are differences, obviously we want to better understand them. Our second main goal of these two studies was to compare the autobiographical memory search and elaboration phases, once again, by contrasting regional activations during different conditions and functional connectivity patterns between these two phases. And our third main goal was to capitalize on our narrated retrieval paradigm by examining dynamic activation of brain regions as participants naturalistically retrieve memory content. In these studies, we're looking at object content and scene content. We then also examined to what extent the hippocampus, a key memory hub, shows greater connectivity to brain regions supporting object and scene processing as participants retrieved corresponding memory content as indexed by words that they're speaking. Okay, to address these three goals, we utilized an overtly narrated autobiographical memory retrieval paradigm in which participants silently retrieved memories for half of the scanning runs and overtly retrieved memories for the other half of the scanning runs. This method is somewhat uncommon in fMRI studies, as speaking in the scanner induces head movement, and head movement is problematic for fMRI scanning because it can attenuate signal and introduce movement artifacts. We address these problems by training participants to speak at a normal volume, holding their head as still as possible. We also fixed their heads in place with inflatable pillows within the scanner and used modern pre-processing methods like independent components analysis to maximally denoise our data. A second hurdle to overt speech during fMRI scanning is just straight up that the scanner is really loud, and the loudest part of the scanner is where the participant's head is. So luckily, advances in microphone technology have allowed us to place a microphone directly into the scanner about an inch away from the participants' mouths. And new software has allowed us to strip out the repetitive noise from the scanner itself. So you can see that as the scanner comes online in this waveform, this loud repetitive noise is fairly prominent, but then as our noise canceling software kicks in, the noise is mainly stripped out. And that leaves us with fairly good quality narrative recordings. They sound like this.
On my first day of teaching this year, I walked in and I was pretty nervous. I think I tried to smile, but the students' faces were really dull. No one wanted to be there, clearly.
So you can see that you can hear that they're not anywhere near perfect, but they're very much usable recordings within the loud environment of the scanner. So once in the scanner, participants first performed a low-level attentional baseline task, which indicated the direction in which a series of arrows pointed, basically just left and right, a very low-level attentional baseline. And then we cued autobiographical memory retrieval using the Galton-Krovitz method, which is one of the most widely used autobiographical memory cue techniques. The way this technique works is that a participant is presented with a cue word like party or river or clothes, and then searches their memory in our study for an episodic autobiographical memory from the past few years, because we were focusing on recent memories in this study. Once they have the memory firmly in mind, they pressed a button on a button box. And if the scanning run was a silent run, they relived the memory silently within their own head for the remainder of the elaboration phase. Or if the scanning run was a narrated run, they overtly retrieved the memory. They narrated it out loud. And then continued to elaborate on the memory until cued to finish, and then rated the memory for reliving and valence. Following scanning, we modeled the autobiographical memory retrieval trials by measuring the amount of time between the presentation of the cue word and the button press as the search phase, and then matched an equal amount of time, which we modeled as an elaboration phase, as the elaboration phase. The one caveat to this is that for just under half of our trials, participants retrieved memories very rapidly, more rapidly than we expected. So for trials in which the button press occurred within 2 and 6 seconds after the memory cue was presented, we extended the search phase to 6 seconds, and then matched with a 6-second elaboration phase. We then examined, yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry. I think I'm echoing somewhere. Okay, there we go. We then examined 3 memory retrieval periods: the search phase, the elaboration phase, and the combination of both of them, the overall AM retrieval phase. And finally, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be speaking about speech processing regions. We mainly took these from this study by Beruzmand, which was single word speech processing, identifying speech production and perception areas. So I'm just going to talk about those as speech processing areas. Okay, moving on to experiment 1, we examined regional activation during autobiographical memory retrieval. And we began by looking at only our silent autobiographical memory retrieval runs and examining whether predicted core network regions activated. Consistent with predictions, we observed activation in important memory regions, including the hippocampus, prefrontal cortices, and the posterior cingulate cortex. And these findings conceptually replicate numerous previous studies of silent autobiographical memory retrieval and provide a solid conceptual base against which we can compare narrated autobiographical memory retrieval, which we then did. We examined narrated autobiographical memory retrieval and observed activation of core network regions, again, broadly consistent with predictions. Further, during narrated autobiographical memory retrieval, as somewhat of a sanity check, we anticipated that we would observe strong activation of speech processing regions. This is kind of like the most prediction that we have. And indeed, we saw strong activation of a number of speech production and perception networks. A subset of those regions are highlighted here. Following examination of silent and narrated retrieval independently, we then directly contrasted activation during silent retrieval against narrative retrieval, and observed activation in the hippocampus, posterior cingulate cortex, and left angular gyrus that was stronger during silent retrieval than narrative retrieval. And these 3 regions are commonly observed to activate during recollection tasks. And one possible interpretation of their stronger activation during silent retrieval is that it's possible that during narrative retrieval, participants are dividing attention somewhat between narrative structuring, speech production, and the memory retrieval itself, resulting in silent retrieval possibly being a bit more of a pure autobiographical memory retrieval task than narrative retrieval. We then examined a reverse contrast of narrative retrieval compared to silent retrieval and observed stronger activation in speech processing regions, as well as the posterior hippocampus and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Our interpretation of stronger activation in these regions is that when participants are overtly narrating autobiographical memories, they may be retrieving more sensory details to weave into a narrative, supported by the posterior hippocampus, which has been implicated in the retrieval of fine-grained memory detail, and then temporarily supporting that detail in working memory and using cognitive control in working memory regions like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as they are building out a narrative and sharing it. We then examined activation, which was stronger during memory search than elaboration, and observed similar activation during both silent and narrated retrieval in predicted core network regions, which have been shown to be more active during search. However, the reverse contrast highlighting brain regions which were more active during AM elaboration than search, autobiographical memory elaboration than search, revealed a much more limited set of activations in general in both conditions. And though we only observed activation of one core network region, the left angular gyrus, the important finding here, the important takeaway here is that once again, in both silent and narrative retrieval, we're observing a similar pattern of activation in both conditions. Okay, to address our third main goal, we then examined activation which corresponded to retrieval of object and scene memory content. And to do this, we took memory narratives, searched through them for content words like Starbucks, home for scene, and coffee and donut for object, and modeled them as events of interest within our memory time courses using time-locked narrative transcripts as an event-related design. We predicted that when participants retrieved category-specific memory content, that they would reactivate corresponding category-specific object and scene-selective perceptual content regions, including the LO for objects and the RSC and PPA for scenes. Though these regions are typically considered perceptual processing regions, we predicted that they would be dynamically reactivated during content retrieval based on the reactivation hypothesis. So based on this hypothesis, which suggests that successful retrieval is partially dependent upon reinstantiation of the same network of the same patterns of brain activity that occurred during encoding. And based on this hypothesis, we predicted that when people retrieved object or scene memory content, that they would reactivate these content-specific functional regions. And we estimated these functional regions using functional parcels, which are large parcels meant to replicate functionally localizing these regions. And they've been shown to do so in over 80% of participants. Okay, to test this hypothesis, we then restricted our search space to only these ROIs, these 3 bilaterally represented non-overlapping ROIs, and performed a voxel-wise analysis within the restricted search volume, correcting for multiple comparisons within the smaller search space, process that's called small volume correction in SPM terminology. Okay, we then directly contrasted the neural correlates of object content retrieval against scene content retrieval and observed that there was significant activation within the lateral occipital cortex consistent with our hypothesis. When we then reversed the contrast of contrasting scene against object retrieval, we also observed activation within the RSC, the retrosplenial cortex, a scene region. However, we also observed activation of a small cluster within the LO, a little bit less than a quarter of the size of the one observed during the object retrieval. And this was contrary to our expectations. This active cluster during scene retrieval within an object processing region was unexpected, but it may be indicating that dynamic reactivation of these brain regions to support content retrieval is a more complex interrelated process than we initially anticipated. To summarize findings from experiment 1, we've begun the first steps towards bridging the gap between the broad literature of silent autobiographical memory retrieval and overt retrieval methods by reporting similar activation of core network regions regardless of retrieval modality, though we highlight some important differences observed. For example, comparing silent to narrative retrieval, we observed stronger activation of recollection regions, and contrasting narrated retrieval against silent retrieval, we observed stronger activation of memory detail, working memory, and speech processing regions. We also observed similar patterns of activation when contrasting search and elaboration in both narrated and silent retrieval. And we found support for the hypothesis that retrieval of memory content activates corresponding content-specific brain regions broadly. Okay, moving on to experiment 2, we examined patterns of functional connectivity during autobiographical memory retrieval. And to characterize these patterns of connectivity during AM retrieval, we examined 2 different networks of brain regions, a core network comprised of the 18 nodes discussed previously, and a whole brain functional parcellation of 263 ROIs. We assessed connectivity differences between conditions using 2 different but complementary methods. First, we examined ROI to ROI bivariate correlations, where we corrected for multiple comparisons using a fairly conservative Bonferroni correction, allowing for inference at the level of individual connections between regions. So for example, you could, in these examples, you could say that the medial prefrontal cortex is significantly connected to the posterior cingulate cortex. We then utilized a network-based statistics approach to examine large-scale networks like our whole brain functional parcellation. So we use this approach to examine, again, ROI to ROI connectivity within networks of connected brain regions which differ between conditions. Though this measure is, so this network-based statistic measure is much more sensitive than a Boniferoni correction. It's limited in that inferences relating to findings from this method are only appropriate at the level of network level interpretation. We then used a graph theory approach to measure ROI centrality as measured by degree and global efficiency metrics. So I'll mainly focus on global efficiency today. The results were very similar. More central regions or hubs have been identified as playing more of a role of coordinating information between regions than non-hub regions. And we corrected these graph theory results for multiple comparisons using a false discovery rate approach to allow for ROI level inferences. Okay, to begin, we examined bivariate correlations within the core autobiographical memory network using the network-based statistics approach and observed strong connectivity of the entire core network during both narrated and silent search, elaboration, and overall autobiographical memory. So all 6 of our independent conditions, all 6 of our conditions. Excuse me. This finding supports the conclusion that autobiographical memory network connectivity patterns within the core network are broadly similar during both narrated and silent retrieval. We then examined what brain regions were more hub-like during each of these 6 conditions and observed that the entire core network was significantly more interconnected than by chance. Additionally, we observed that across all conditions, the anterior hippocampus, medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and left angular gyrus were consistently the regions with the highest centrality ratings as measured by global efficiency. This finding is notable as these brain regions are consistently implicated as important central regions to autobiographical memory retrieval processes, even within the core network of brain regions. We then directly contrasted silent retrieval against narrated retrieval with the core network, and Boniferoni corrected our results to allow for ROI to ROI connection level inferences. We observed that during silent retrieval, the medial prefrontal cortex was more strongly connected to the posterior cingulate cortex than during narrative retrieval, and that during narrated retrieval, the posterior cingulate cortex was more strongly connected to the superior parietal lobe. One possible explanation for this pattern of results is that the medial PFC, which has been shown to support self-referential content processing, may be more active during silent retrieval because during silent retrieval, individuals are free to introspect without the constraints of constructing a memory narrative. And it's possible that the medial prefrontal cortex may be connecting to the posterior cingulate cortex to support integration of this additional self-referential content into the overall memory. And by contrast, it's possible that the posterior cingulate cortex and superior parietal lobule, which have both been shown to support processing of sensory detail, it's possible that these regions are becoming connected during narrated retrieval as individuals construct the narrative, including more reference to sensory memory detail. We then went on and directly contrasted silent and narrated retrieval in the whole brain using graph metrics and identified a single brain region which was more centrally located during narrated autobiographical memory retrieval than during silent retrieval, the left anterior middle temporal gyrus. This region has been well established as a speech processing region, and we suggested it may be coordinating, integrating, and orchestrating narrative speech production. Finally, to examine whether retrieval of object and scene content elicited connectivity between the hippocampus, this key memory region, and corresponding content-specific cortex, including the LO, PPA, and RSC, we utilized a seed-based connectivity approach, and we selected 4 hippocampal seeds, the left and right anterior and posterior hippocampus, and used a voxel-wise whole brain approach to detect what brain regions the hippocampus was more strongly connected to during retrieval of object and scene content. Though we predicted that the hippocampus would connect to the LO during object retrieval and the PPA or RSC during scene retrieval, we did not observe this pattern of connectivity. However, further exploration of what the connectivity that we did observe revealed that the regions we observed the hippocampus to be connected to during object content retrieval have been shown in other studies to support semantic representation of objects, and that the one region that the hippocampus connected to during scene retrieval has been shown in other studies to support integration of memory detail into a previously retrieved memory scene. So these results suggest that our content hypotheses may have been too limited to perceptual regions and suggest that it would be valuable to examine broader networks supporting memory content retrieval, including, for example, semantic processing regions. Okay, so in conclusion, oh, I've got my laser on the screen, sorry. So in conclusion, these studies taken together support that overt retrieval can be used successfully to interrogate the neural correlates of and connectivity patterns of autobiographical memory retrieval, and that regional activation and functional connectivity in the core autobiographical memory network is broadly similar regardless of retrieval modality. We also showed that speech-related motion can be mitigated using modern analytic techniques and technology, and that content retrieval reactivates corresponding content-specific cortex during moment-to-moment retrieval of content. There are some limitations of these studies, including that our naturalistic retrieval paradigm intentionally reduced control over what kind of memory content was retrieved during narrated elaboration, meaning that some categories that we were interested in, like emotional memory words, were simply not common enough to analyze in this sample. Another limitation was that in contrast to the often extended search phase lengths reported in other studies of search and elaboration, we had many search phases which were very rapid, limiting some of the analyses that we could perform. Further, additional studies of silent and narrated autobiographical memory retrieval would be highly valuable to establish the generality and reliability of these results via conceptual and/or direct replication. Some interesting future directions include examination of content reactivation in additional content categories like emotion, faces, or self-referential content, and utilizing more sensitive multivariate pattern classification techniques, to identify patterns of activation supporting memory content retrieval. Also, though, for this study, we modeled activation corresponding to content words as occurring simultaneously to the utterance of the word. There's evidence from single word speech research that activation can actually predict utterance of corresponding content words by a second or even more. So examining when this neural activation peaks during naturalistic retrieval would be an interesting line of investigation. Further, a broader investigation into network dynamics supporting content retrieval, examining contexts like contribution of semantic processing and differential activation between content processing regions would be interesting. Finally, at this time, there's also just not much known about how silent and narrated retrieval differ behaviorally. Studies examining differences in emotional content, vividness, and social aspects of silent versus narrative retrieval would be of great value. So in conclusion, the results of these current studies support that overt retrieval is a promising method which can be used to study the neural bases of this rich, complex, temporally extended memory retrieval process in important new ways.